Hello again. This month we're going to be working on seashells. I initially thought we would do this last month, but my goodness, there's so many shapes and different types of seashells that I thought that they could use a month all to themselves. This one even has some surprise barnacles on the inside of it. And before we start out, I really wanted to show you this book. It's by a local BC based author named Nick Bantock, who makes beautiful books. And this book has this page, which has some really interesting looking seashells and other mysterious things. And this is something that I found by the side of the road when I was out for a walk the other day. I expect it was from an Italian restaurant rather than from the nearby beach. So let's get started making a bed of mussels. I've already set up my background area. I've chosen this white little lump here to represent the ground, a little mound on the ground. And I'm going to do a whole collection of teeny tiny mussels to create a mussel bed down here. And really simple, just two little chain stitches attached to each other at the bottom there, side by side, pointing generally upwards. And if you don't have sort of a mental picture of what a mussel bed looks like, you could take a look online. There's loads of them. It could also be an oyster beds. The oysters that we have here in BC are quite lumpy and bumpy, but I guess there are more smooth textured oysters elsewhere. All I'm doing is just repeating this over and over again. Two little chain stitches beside each other, vaguely pointing upwards that look like an open oyster. And I'm using two strands of embroidery cotton. One is dark brown and the other one is a dark green. And I really like the subtle variety in the shading on these oyster shells here. Now, one thing that I noticed after I started stitching is that the two strands that I'm using did not create a very full chain stitch, and you could still see the white through the chain stitch there. But I don't think that's really a problem, because if you remember when I showed you that mussel that I had found, the inside looks fairly light and the outside is dark. So if you can see some lighter colors peeking through the dark, I don't think that that's a problem at all. It just really depends on which way the shells are facing. And if it bothers you, you don't like it, you can always go back in and add some more, just some small straight stitches inside the white area just to cover that up a little bit, and then you'll have a more solid dark colored oyster shell. You could also use more strands of floss, 3 or 4 perhaps, maybe in 3 or 4 different colors, all in sort of a darkish tones that will add lots of depth and interest to your stitching. And the other thing is, you don't want all your oyster shells to be pointing in exactly the same direction. You want some pointing one way, some pointing the other way, and you also want them to be randomly spaced. Now, randomly spaced does not mean evenly spaced. It means that some of them are going to be closer together, some of them are going to be further apart, some may be overlapping, but there's variety and variation. I think that being a beginner, not being an expert, is actually to your advantage here, because people that have been practicing stitching and embroidery for a long time typically are very good at making things very even and precise. And it's hard for them to make things irregular. Whereas when you're starting out, things just turn out irregularly without even trying. So I think those of you who feel like you're a beginner here are actually at an advantage. And now I've finished off with that first thread, and I've moved on, and I'm using more threads here. This time they're all the same color. They're all black this time. And you'll notice here that I'm adding these stitches right at the top of that mound, and they're extending beyond the top. So that again is giving perspective and depth to my piece. You can tell that these are sitting in front of those anemones that I've put on there. I found this fabric when I trimmed it down. It made very effective looking anemones, so I thought that it belonged there. Now, you'll notice that every once in a while I have some problems with my stitching, and my thread gets knotted up. Well, I think in this case that's those sorts of accidents are actually fine because not all oysters in the natural world are going to be exactly precise. Some of them are going to be broken, some of them are going to be misshapen. So that's actually a benefit if you're trying to create something that has a somewhat realistic vibe to it. And here I'm having trouble here with this thread. It's got all knotted up, and I'll spend some time trying to get it untangled and get all those threads pulled through, but ultimately I decided that it's not worth the time it was taking, and I decided I'm going to have one imperfect mussel there, and that's all okay. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of stitches in this piece, and right now this is a stitch that I've just made, and it's the most important one to me, and I could let it bother me that it's not perfect, or I can just let it be and it will be a slightly imperfect, irregular mussel shell. And by the time I've finished, no one will ever know it's there. And if they do know it's there, if they do notice it, all they will think is that it's adding interest and texture. And if somebody asks you about it, if you say it with confidence that, yeah, I meant to do that. I didn't want them to all be perfect little pristine plastic looking oysters. I wanted them to look more natural, oysters or mussels or whatever they are, then they'll believe you. It's really quite a surprising thing. And now another thing that I've noticed is because now I've changed the colors. First shells that I made were made with a dark brown and dark green thread, and they're all clustered together. And now I've changed to the 3 strands off this black thread, and now these are all clustered together as well. And I could leave it like that if I wanted to, or I could try to take some of these dark ones and intersperse them with the green ones, or maybe add some green ones through the cluster off the black ones. And even though the color differences are quite subtle and may not be all that noticeable online, you can definitely see the difference in person. And you could tell yourself whatever story you want. Maybe there are 2 different species of mussels, some that are black and some of that are a slightly different color, and they grow in clusters beside each other because that's where they were placed or laid, or I don't know, whatever story you want. Or you can mix them up and then it has a different story to it. It's really up to you. How do you want your clusters to appear? Do you want them to have variety in amongst them, or do you want to have the ones that are similar clustered together? There is a psychological design principle that is called Gestalt, which says that things that are grouped closely together or that seem similar, like by color and size and shape and pattern, seem like they belong together, and things that are more different, either spaced further apart or different in color and shape and pattern, seem like they don't belong together. So by clustering all of my black mussels together, that tells you that they somehow are related and connected to each other. And then the greeny brown ones are also somehow connected to each other because they are all the same color and they are all together. But if I had mingled them together, then they would look like just one mass of shells that had slightly different colors, just because the way that the light was shining on them, perhaps the age of them, they would not look so separate. So that's something to consider when you're creating a design here. Now you may notice that there is a shell there beside where I'm working on right now, and that shell is called a nautilus, and it's something that I had been thinking about including when I did the section on tentacles, but I decided that there was enough going on that month already, and that I could include that particular creature in this month when we were working on shells. So that'll be another video that's coming out this month. But for now, I'm just still working away on my oysters, or my mussels, and this is basically all I do. I just keep going. In some cases I'll just do 1 chain stitch, but most of the time I'm doing 2. Sometimes you may not be able to see both sides of it. You may only see one side, and maybe some of the shells are broken and there's only 1 piece remaining. But the main key here is variety. I do want some of the background to show through, because if I just had this densely packed mass of black chain stitches, you wouldn't really be able to see what was going on. It would just be a textured black mass. So I want the background to be visible, but I also want it to be really full. And there you go. There is the finished mussel bed for now. I might add more stitches later, and here's a closer version of it. Anyway, once again, happy stitching, and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.